Did Saudi Arabia just blink? OPEC announcing a plan to curb oil production by the end of the year. Riyadh suddenly in favor of closing the tap after long shrugging off collapsing crude prices with an eye to squeezing both regional rival Iran and U.S. shale oil, unprofitable in these days of sub-$50 a barrel crude. So will OPEC really tighten production as they've announced? Is the world's largest oil producer really feeling the pinch? It's just announced austerity measures, but still sits on a massive sovereign wealth fund. What does that money buy when you see the U.S. Congress overriding a presidential veto on suing the Saudis over links to the 9/11 attacks? Finally, it's not just our dependence on Saudi oil, but oil in general. Paris, which at the end of last year hosted a climate change summit, now home to its annual motor show. 1 in 4 models sold in this country are now gas-guzzling SUVs. What does the future hold on that score? Today in the France 24 debate, what is the deal with oil? And with us from Jeddah, Mohammed Al-Saban, former longtime consultant to the Saudi Oil Ministry. Thank you for being with us in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.
From Washington, welcome back Reza Marashi of the National Iranian American Council. Here in the studio, Nicolas Ménard, he focuses on energy and transport for business consultants Frost and Sullivan.
Good evening.
Thank you for being with us. And from London, Michel Maiden of consultancy Energy Aspects. Thanks for joining the show. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. OPEC, it's the club of nations that pumps out more than 1/3 of the world's oil. It's agreed for the first time since 2008 to curb output. Clément Bonnereau has more.
A surprise decision. OPEC members have agreed to cut oil production for the first time in 8 years.
Today, OPEC has taken a historic decision. OPEC will go back to its role of monitoring the market. It's a role that it lost many years ago. It is reclaiming it.
The decision is aimed at boosting global crude prices, which have collapsed over the past 2 years, reaching a 13-year low of $27 a barrel in January. Full details of the agreement will be finalized at an OPEC meeting in Vienna this November. Output is set to fall by about 700,000 barrels a day, though it's unclear whether the cuts will be evenly distributed across OPEC members. Previous efforts at reaching a deal had been prevented by disagreements between regional rivals Iran and Saudi Arabia. Riyadh had made it clear it would not cut production unless Tehran did the same, but now countries like Iran, Nigeria and Libya could be allowed to increase output.
2.5 years we had a very constructive agreement in OPEC, and it means that OPEC can overcome to the many very difficult situations.
Higher prices could provide much-needed financial relief to other oil-producing countries such as Venezuela. The country has seen inflation skyrocket and its current deficit soar in recent months.
All right, just to tell you, the price of crude, which surged Wednesday up nearly 6%, that's tapered off since. It's now flat, or actually in negative territory. Let me begin with you, Mohammed Al-Saban. First of all, is this deal for real?
I couldn't hear the question. Is this deal for real, you said?
Yes.
Yes. Well, actually, OPEC has agreed to have an agreement, but it is a general framework that will be negotiated in order to arrive at a detailed deal. It is not a finished deal. Still, too many issues are going to be negotiated. And as we always say, the devil is in the details. So, and that is why you have seen the markets are very, cautiously optimistic, and prices did not rise to the level where it was expected. So
you sound cautious, by the way.
Good. I am cautious, yes, but I think this time OPEC and non-OPEC, mainly Russia, they have sensed the urgency of trying to stabilize prices, oil prices. All oil producers are in real need for additional oil revenues for their budget to cover any budget deficit. So I think with this understanding, they came together, and it shows that OPEC is still alive, contrary to what has been said in the West, that OPEC is dead. It is not dead, but it requires, or it is asking the cooperation of non-OPECs, not only Russia, but also others like Mexico, Norway, and others.
All right, so that there are a lot of ifs, and it's true that there were discussions with Russia, Nicolas Mélan, before this announcement that came out of Algiers on Wednesday. But it's between OPEC members that there's the biggest surprise, because Saudi Arabia and Iran have reached an agreement, it seems like.
Yeah, today it's between OPEC members. But what is interesting is that Russia have been involved in those discussions in the last couple of months, trying to put the position of Saudi Arabia and Iran to find an agreement. So they kind of facilitated this deal, even if they are excluded from the deal. But I totally agree. Many people thought that the OPEC was dead, and the OPEC is not dead. The OPEC is still alive for the time being. As you said, it's just a starting point for an agreement. And we remember that back in 2008, and the last time they cut the production, they cut it by 4 million barrels. And you had a price increase from $20 to $30. So if they cut it by 700,000, it's not likely to have much an impact on prices.
Reza Marashi, do you have a sense this could be a turning point in the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the first time that we've seen them publicly agree on anything in a long while?
No, I think it's an important... You're correct to point that out, no question about it. And I think it's an important step for two reasons. One, I think it's important because I wouldn't say that the Saudis have blinked. I think that the Saudis made a wise and pragmatic decision that they deserve credit for. Agreeing that Iran will be allowed to resume its pre-sanctions productions level is critical to ensuring that there's buy-in amongst all OPEC members, so that the system of OPEC as a whole is mutually beneficial to all members. But perhaps even more importantly, it demonstrates that even at a time of heightened regional tensions, two important countries that need each other in Iran and Saudi Arabia can put the whole set of differences aside to focus on core issues that affect the economic and political security interests of both countries. And I think that could potentially serve as a model going forward to address a variety of other issues of conflict and tension between the two countries.
Yeah, this doesn't happen in a bubble, is what you're saying, that this could have a knock-on effect on, what, the conflict in Yemen, the conflict in Syria, the standoff between the two nations more broadly?
More broadly, absolutely. There's no shortage of differing opinions, concerns, and interests between Iran and Saudi Arabia today. But since the beginning of this year, various channels of communication have faltered, if not outright been eliminated. So having a channel of communication at a place such as OPEC is critical to demonstrating to both capitals that dialogue can produce mutually beneficial results that are in the interests of both sides. And hopefully the political leadership of both countries will see this as a model to perhaps resume some of the back-channel private discussions that frankly haven't been taking place for quite some time.
Reza, Iran's output is now back to its pre-sanctions level, or nearly. What we're at 3.6 billion barrels a day. The Iranians going into that meeting saying they'd sign on to curbs once they'd reach the 4 million barrel a day mark. Let me ask you about this. Right now, is Iranian oil back online faster than you thought?
It is online. It's back online faster than I thought it would be, but I say that acknowledging the very real challenges and hurdles that remain for Iran's oil industry. Its infrastructure is decrepit. Remaining sanctions are a hindrance to further foreign investment going forward, so that needs to be ironed out. And Iran's own petroleum and energy contracts need to be updated, and they've taken steps in this regard, but it needs internal approval, and it needs to be presented to the international community that present terms that are attractive to foreign investors, because for quite some time foreign investors weren't getting the protections that were necessary on their investment to make investments in Iran's energy infrastructure worthwhile. So they've come a long way, but there's still a long ways to go, and I think that's an important point to make.
Michel Maïdan, let me ask you, because Iran coming online a little bit faster than we thought. Right now, in the last few months, the Saudis have been pumping out oil in record levels. The Russians have been pumping out oil at record levels. Now, I know that there's trouble in other places, like Nigeria, where we've had attacks in the Delta, like Libya, of course, and Venezuela. But right now, when you look at what's actually concretely happening among oil producers, do you believe that there will be a curb in output?
There seems likely to be a curb in output, or to put it differently, they are very close. The Saudis and the Iranians are closer than they have been to an agreement, most likely because both sides are feeling the pinch of lower for longer oil prices as we've seen them now. The devil is in the details, but the Saudis seem likely to make the cuts that they will promise to undertake. The GCC members have historically been quite good at living up to their commitments, so the bulk of the burden will fall onto the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the UAE, sort of the normal GCC or the GCC countries. The fluctuations will come with Libya and Nigeria that sort of in October we see them increasing production a little bit, but their situations remain relatively precarious. So an effective cut, and we have to agree on the baselines as well. The figures that are reported vary quite substantially, but any cut could go anywhere from 400,000 barrels a day to as much as 700,000 barrels a day, and that ultimately does accelerate the process of rebalancing that is currently underway. We tend to focus a lot on OPEC and US shale and forget that there are quite a few production declines happening in non-OPEC conventional output, be it China, Canada, Kazakhstan, Mexico, Colombia. The market is rebalancing, but it has taken a lot longer than many had anticipated, and there are lots of stocks that need to be drawn.
Were you surprised by this announcement out of Algiers at the OPEC meeting?
I was surprised that it came today. There was no urgency for it to come today, but on the whole, I think the trend was towards a meeting of minds. Again, the Saudis are under greater financial pressure, and the Iranians have probably, without wanting to admit it, peaked in terms of their ability to increase production, at least in the near term. So now the game is, how do you communicate an agreement, both internally and externally? Everybody will want to say that they won, that they have gotten what they wanted, but ultimately somebody is going to have to cut and agree for the Iranians, agree to freeze output, which would probably be a recognition of, again, the limited gains that are possible for them in the near term.
Mohammed Al-Saban, do you agree with what Reza Marashi said, that this could be a gateway for agreements between the Saudis and the Iranians on topics that go well beyond just oil?
Well, I think Saudi Arabia has shown good intention by offering to reduce its production to the level of last January, and also by announcing that they understand the need of the three countries, Iran, Libya and Nigeria, to go back to their pre-sanction or pre-troubles, internal troubles levels. So I think Saudi Arabia has shown that intention, the same as it is always showing on political level. In political level, we are saying we can extend our hand to Iran, given that they don't intervene in the regional issues matters. But I think we are still need to work out that. This is a good introduction to any kind of dialogue. Saudi Arabia is always ready if Iran is ready, and by saying ready, not only just talk for the sake of the talk, but ready to stop interfering in the internal issues of different different regional countries. So I think we are there, but we need someone who can really control the dialogue. But going back to the production, I mean the current agreement among OPEC, I think OPEC has made it very clear, and also Saudi Arabia, in 2014, that we have only 32% of the total world production. We cannot do it alone. And when Russia started to approach OPEC and showing interest in cooperating with OPEC, then things start to roll over.
Right, the discussions you're saying with Mohammed, the discussions you're saying with Russia were key. We have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Across Africa, presented by Georgia Calvin-Smith.
From North to South Africa, from Bamako to Nairobi, from Accra to Mogadishu. Bringing you all the political, economic, cultural and social news from Africa for a better insight into an ever-changing continent.
Across Africa on France 24 and France24.com. The Observer's Direct, presented by Gail Four.
In this new episode of Observer's Direct, we head to Bangalore to meet with our observer Tanguy. He's one of tens of thousands of young Africans who have decided to come to India to pursue their university education. Now, while many are happy with their courses, they also face numerous challenges, including discrimination, attacks by mobs on the street, and scams by some unscrupulous colleges.
The Observer's Direct on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. You're watching France 24. Coming up, we'll give you the latest on that train crash in a suburb of New York City in Hoboken, New Jersey. At least one killed, more than 100 are injured. It happened during morning rush hour as the train crashed into its terminal platform. World leaders including Barack Obama, François Hollande, but also Mahmoud Abbas, expected in Israel for Friday's funeral of former President Shimon Peres, the last of his generation. India claims surgical strikes against militants inside Pakistan. Islamabad denies. At least 2 Pakistani soldiers killed in cross-border firing. An Indian soldier captured on the Pakistani side of the border. Delhi claims that he had wandered across unknowingly. Connected and electric cars front and center at the Paris Auto Show, all the while low gas prices have SUV sales soaring, say manufacturers. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're looking at what could be an agreement that ends this period of low oil we've seen around the globe over the last few years. It was an OPEC meeting. It was an agreement on an agreement, as a panelist, Mohammed Al-Saban, said. He is in Jeddah, former longtime consultant to the Saudi oil ministry. Welcome back. Welcome back from Washington, Reza Marashi of the National Iranian American Council. And we're also with Nicolas Mélan, who focuses on energy and transport with business consultants Frost and Sullivan, and Michelle Maiden of consultancy Energy Aspects in London. Just, I want to ask you before we continue on, Nicolas, you're an economist, you're not a political scientist, but you know the expression follow the money, right? So when you look at the price of crude oil, do you kind of get a sense of where politics go in the Middle East?
Well, looking at the price of crude oil, I mean, there's been some discussion today saying that Saudi Arabia needs more money, and that's why they're trying to increase the price of oil with this reduction. But if you look carefully, the Saudis, even if they have $100 billion deficit last year, they're still sitting on $600 billion and have Saudi Aramco, which they maybe plan to sell part of it, which is still $3,500 billion. So today, a lot of people said Saudi needs the money. I don't think that's one of the reasons for the deal.
That is an open question, and let me put it to you, Mohammed Al-Saban, because we know that it was announced that as of October 1st, there's going to be a 20% pay cut for for civil servants, including government ministers, austerity measures. Does Saudi Arabia need to do that?
Well, if you take it alone without looking at the Vision 2030 and its program, then definitely you will say, well, maybe Saudi Arabia is in a real need for reducing expenditure or generating more revenue or saving more revenue. But it is not the case. Actually, Saudi Arabia, since the beginning of this year, have started, or even at the second half of last year, started with the quick wins opportunities that, economic diversification cannot be realized in the short term. So it will take some long term. So they started with the imposition of taxes on the unutilized land. They have rationalized fuel subsidies. As a matter of fact, they raised the fuel prices, electricity prices. So they have taken different measures, not this year, but even at the end of last year. So it is not, you cannot take it in separation. This step that been taken 2 days ago, you cannot take it in isolation of the total economic reform that already started in Saudi Arabia. We have a serious economic reform that will be healthy to the Saudi economy. If you are fat and you have a lot of some unnecessary fat in your body, then you need to do exercise. You need to go on diet in order to be slim and try to compete with others. Not like, just simply continue business as usual. So Saudi Arabia is very serious. They know that oil, the whole world oil is changing. It is not only because of shale oil, but we have a problem with the demand for oil. We have the electric cars. We have the CAFE standard. We have now additionally in your city, in Paris, last year, we have adopted, even though Saudi Arabia is part of the agreement, we have adopted the climate change agreement. But we know that climate change agreement, given its selectivity, while they are giving coal subsidies, they are penalizing and taxing and adding taxes to the already heavy taxes on oil products. So I think we know that the picture is changing. We know that the demand for oil is going to peak by probably 2025 or 2030. And that is very serious for us. We need to reduce our dependency on oil before the world reduce its dependency on oil.
Reza Marashi, what was your reaction when you saw that the Saudis were slashing the salaries of civil servants?
Well, on the one hand, I give Saudi Arabia credit for attempting to undertake tremendous economic reform. We should have no illusions about how difficult that is, but the difficulty would apply to any country, not just Saudi Arabia. The flip side, of course, is that the social contract between the Saudi government and the Saudi people is undergoing some pretty significant changes. So I like the analogy that my friend in Riyadh made about if perhaps you're putting on a bit more weight than you're comfortable with, you exercise. But you could also extend the exercise analogy to the Saudi population, which is if they're exercising and they're not losing the weight that they seek to lose, then what happens then? What kind of other means would they take up? So it's not just about the Saudi government, and it is important as it pertains to the Saudi government, but it's also important about how these different kinds of economic changes that Saudi Arabia is undertaking affect innocent Saudi people. And we just don't know, A, what the long-term ramifications of that will be, and B, what kinds of impact that will have on the social contract that's existed, frankly, for quite some time.
Yeah, Mohammed Al-Saban, I'm seeing reactions from ordinary Saudis. Some of them are grumbling about this.
Well, it is natural. I think even in the industrialized countries, when you have an austerity plan, you see some reaction from the public. That's very natural. But I want to let you know that Saudi Arabia is also taking into consideration some measures to mitigate some of the impact of these policies. By the way, the recent policies reduction of the salary of the ministers and Shura Council is not a general reduction. It is not affecting all other government employees. Actually, what it affects is the other benefits that the employees are getting, and some of these benefits have been misused. So now you are trying to rationalize these benefits and try to see if you can reduce the expenditure. Don't forget that Saudi Arabia is spending more than 2/3 of its budget on the salaries of its employees.
Yeah.
And so it is a very serious problem that we need to take a very serious decision, given that you need to take or to mitigate the impact on those low-income people.
All right, I want to bring up something that was mentioned earlier, which is, of course, late in 2014, just as oil prices were starting to go south, there was The Economist that had a cover story that featured the battle for market share, not between Gulf monarchies and Iran, but between Gulf monarchies and the booming shale oil and gas revolution in the United States. There you see the cover, sheikhs versus shale. Of course, now that the price of oil is below $50 a barrel, there really has been a squeeze. How much of a squeeze, Nicolas Mélan, has there been for shale oil?
In terms of shale oil, the US, the production peaked last year at 4.5 million barrels on top of 4 million barrels of conventional oil, so 5 million barrels, so it's 9.5. And in 1 year, the production declined by 1 million barrels of oil.
Is that something that's easy to ramp up once the price of oil goes back up?
Well, people thought that it would be very straightforward, and as long as the oil go over, they started at $40, but nothing happened, and then they say $50. And now at $50, it's interesting to see the impact. The real impact is not on the production at the beginning, because people tend to produce at maximum to compensate the loss, but it's on the investment, on the rigs, on the drilling. And we've seen the drilling count decrease by 80%. And some people said in May, when the oil was over $50, they're going to start to dig again. But what we see is it only happens in the Permian Basin, which is only 1 million out of 4.5. And on the two big basins, which are the Bacon and Eagle Ford in Texas, the rigs are down 85%.
Okay, so just how much, just very briefly, just how much has the United States weaned itself off of Saudi oil?
Today it's very limited, actually, because the US is producing a very light crude, and what they import from Saudi Arabia is heavy crude. So they import still as much oil as in 2011, because it's not the same oil, but they import less oil from Nigeria, for example. So they haven't actually decreased their dependency on Saudi Arabia.
Right, so the rivalry, though, is building slowly between the United States and to a certain degree and Saudi Arabia. I want to ask this question to Reza Marashi, because where you are in Washington, for the first time in 8 years, a presidential veto was overruled by Congress on Wednesday. It concerned lawsuits against Saudis by U.S. citizens over the 9/11 attacks. Cynics might ask, if there wasn't a shale oil boom, and the U.S. wasn't perhaps less energy dependent than before on abroad, do you think that veto would have been overridden?
You could consider that to be part of it, but I think there's a lot of moving pieces, to be honest with you. An equally important moving piece is that these families have been working on this issue for 15 years. Also, it's an election year in the United States, and if you apply the Washington Post test, congressman running for re-election vetoes Saudi 9/11 bill, that doesn't look good in terms of the domestic political calculations of any American politician. But I think there's a couple important things to point out here, two to be exact. One, while it is important for the United States to protect its national interests and hold the Saudi government accountable, if the Saudi government takes actions that go against American interests, it's equally important for the United States to continue having a functional working relationship with Saudi Arabia. And that is why the White House inserted a provision into the 9/11 bill that allows it to stay lawsuits against the Saudi government if it demonstrates that it is negotiating in good faith with the Saudi government over these various lawsuits and claims. Now, it doesn't define what good faith means, so it's essentially a way to block lawsuits without formally blocking them. So it's an interesting development. I think it's a smart development because you don't want reciprocal lawsuits against the United States that adversely affect American interests.
Mohammed al-Saban, first there was the U.S. among the world powers signing on to lift sanctions against Iran. Now this bill that passes Congress. How do Saudis feel about the U.S. right now?
Well, I think the relationship is evolving, taking into account the different developments that happen. But let me tell you that whatever the decision by the United States Congress to penalize other governments is going to fire back. And I think, as my colleague from London saying, that it is an election time, and you cannot, I don't think that after election that this law will continue. There is already an appeal by some congressmen to reverse that law next year after election. So they know and realize that Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and others will sue the United States government, and not only the United States government, but also the European governments. So I think this will open a Pandora box to all countries, and this is unprecedented, and it is not in the interest of the United States, nor it is in the interest of the West in total. But in the meantime, I think we are going to the east. We have good relationship with China. We have good relationship with India and other emerging economies. And I think from now on, we will gradually, as long as the United States gradually trying to separate itself from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries will gradually separate themselves from the United States. But let me go back to one point. You said the United States will be less dependent on the Gulf. That's not true. As long as the United States import one single barrel, even if it is not from Saudi Arabia, they will be affected by the action of Saudi Arabia. The world oil market is fungible. So I think many people are not totally aware of this fact. So I don't think the United States is calculating its card very carefully. I think they have lifted the sanction with very awkward negotiations vis-a-vis Iran. And I mean, vis-a-vis Iran, of course, they were 5+1. But I think now they realize that Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries are their real friend. Our relationship with the United States has been for more than 60 to 70 years ago, and it has been excellent with the exception of the last few years.
All right, we can talk about this, of course, all night. Unfortunately, time is pressing, so I want to just bring up the rebound on one point, and that is, you heard there Mohammed al-Saban talking about other markets, and there's something we've been talking about production the whole time during this show. We haven't talked about who's buying oil, and China, we know their economy is slowing down. How is the picture changing in terms of who's friends with who when it comes to buying and selling oil?
China is a very interesting topic. Something important happened in China last year. The Chinese oil production peaked at a maximum of 4 million barrels. And as we talk now, it's already down by a couple of 100,000, maybe 400,000 barrels. And we've seen the imports from China increase significantly. It's still increasing. Another important
So
factor,
even though the economy in China is slowing, they're importing more oil.
it's very important to understand where the demand from oil comes from. The demand from oil comes from transport, people buying car. I'll give you an example. In the US, in June 2016, the US people used the most oil, gasoline, in the history of the United States. That was 3 months ago. So the demand is still climbing. People don't understand the main demand factors.
Is it because the gas is cheap at the pump?
Yeah, it's cheaper at the pump. The US have been moving to buy big SUVs, back to big SUVs, and that's the reason
And
why.
it's not just the Americans. Nicolas Menon, your perfect transition here. We're talking about, we're talking on the day when the Paris Motor Show is opening. Here have been loads of reports on TV about connected cars, electric vehicles, but it's too soon to say that your old gas guzzler is ready for the junkyard of history. Way too soon. France 24, Stephen Carroll reports.
I'm here at the stand of the French car maker Renault, and what we can see from this company really is a reflection of the dilemma that's facing car makers across the board. This is Renault's new SUV. It's called a Koleos. It has a diesel engine, a 1.6 litre diesel engine, and this is the sort of cars that people are buying. Renault says that only 1/10 of the cars that it sold in France last year were electric cars, and despite the fact we've seen many car makers here emphasising new electric models, they're simply not what people want. But companies like Renault know that the low oil prices we've seen over the past 18 months are something that is going to have to change sooner or later, and they're preparing themselves for that with new technology that doesn't rely so heavily on oil. Now, when you talk to the car companies, as I've been doing, they won't necessarily tell you they're preparing for an increase in oil prices. They prefer to talk about futuristic technology that's more environmentally friendly, and also how they're hoping that with new technology they'll attract customers to electric vehicles. But there is certainly an undercurrent here, and that worry in the back of people's minds that perhaps while you might be able to buy one of these cars and run it cost efficiently today, doing so in the future might not be as easy.
All right, so there you have it. Stephen Carroll telling us how manufacturers on this continent are hedging their bets over whether or not the price of oil increases. But Reza Marashi, you know, there's often quite a bit of Yankee bashing here about how you have big gas guzzlers over in America. But the statistic is amazing, isn't it? 1 out of every 4 vehicles sold in France at the start of the year was an SUV. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think I'm surprised, frankly. All my trips to Europe usually entail seeing cars that are very tiny, many of which you don't see on the streets of the United States, regardless of what city you're in. But the power of advertising, the power of marketing, I think it's pretty robust. And to see that kind of increase take place, while maybe good for auto manufacturers, is actually kind of sad for the environment. And the issue of climate change is something we haven't seen really any governments take the necessary steps that need to be taken on. So, you know, I'm happy for commerce, but I'm sad for the future, to be perfectly frank.
Nicolas Menon, you heard Stephen Carroll there mention how the manufacturers, the customers, they want bigger cars. They want these SUVs, especially with the price low at the pump. But they're also trying to figure out how they can make them more fuel efficient. Are they succeeding?
Well, today we've seen the Europe in terms of fuel emission and CO2 emission has been leading the way. So they have very fuel emission engine if you compare to what you can have in the US. But it's very true that the cars are small as well. Something interesting about SUVs is it's a very big trend as well in China. All the Chinese people, they want SUVs for Chinese. And that's also one of the reasons why, you know, the oil demand in China is not likely to curb, even though the economy is slowing down.
When you remember the first time when oil hit $100 a barrel, did you think you'd be on a television show in 2016 talking about how 1 in 4 French cars at the first trimester of this year were SUVs?
You have to understand that the impact of low or high oil price is much more limited in Europe than it is in the US, because we have much higher taxes. And basically oil, people forget, but it's very cheap. 1 liter of oil is cheaper than 1 liter of water. So it doesn't really impact you. And that's the key problem for electric cars, because the calculation is that oil price would have to be at 2.5 euro per liter to make it electric car competitive. But by construction, it can't go there, because oil prices can't exceed $150 a barrel for a long time. That's the main problem with electric cars.
Mohammed Al-Saban, I want your reaction to something that Nicolas just said, which is, over in China, the import of oil, it has to do with cars. And is the whole of this, the global fight over energy, for you, is the main obsession, is the top obsession, vehicles, motor vehicles?
But all emerging economies are trying. By the way, most of the incremental increase in the demand for oil is coming from the emerging economies. And when I said that we are going east, we have this in mind, and also a kind of diversification. But let me say that we are fully aware of the different environmental measures being taken by the international community under the name of mitigating climate change, reducing greenhouse gases. And we have supported that, Saudi Arabia. But we also cautiously saying that you need to do it fairly. We are ready to bear our fair share, but not more than that. When we see that you subsidize other sources of energies, and including nuclear, your nuclear in France, and when we see Germany subsidizing coal and at the same time putting heavy tax on oil products, we see that this is a total bias and cannot continue, because it will affect the future demand for oil. So we are acknowledging that there is an international revolution in the energy market, and oil will be penalized more in this regard. Secondly, with regard to the shale oil, I think the technological progress has tremendously reduced the gap, the cost gap between conventional and non-conventional oil. And I think this will continue to be the case. And if it is reduced to a level that will encourage countries who have reserves of shale oil and gas, such as Russia, China, Argentina, and others, then definitely you will see a flood of shale oil and shale gas coming to the market. And that is a worrisome. Let us be realistic. And that is why Saudi Arabia is very serious on the issue of diversifying its economy.
All right, so that brings us to the final question. I'll put it to you, Nicolas. Listening to what we just heard about how there's always new sources of oil that can come on the market, just how high could oil prices go?
High prices go in the last 40 years. We've seen that the maximum in terms of annual prices is $120, and that's the limit. So I believe myself that the main driver for oil prices is not the demand and is not the supply, it's the dollar value. So if the dollar value devaluates, we can see by 20% the oil price will be at $100, as simple as that. And this relation has been working for the last 13 years. So it's very likely...
So it's got more to do with whether or not we get a stronger or weaker dollar, not with...
Yeah, I believe OPEC has some power, but I believe the Fed and the BC has even more power, because they can play on the dollar value, and this is what drives the oil prices.
All right, some food for thought. We'll leave it there. Nicolas Médan, I want to thank you. I want to thank Mohammed Al-Saban for being with us from Jeddah, Reza Marashi in Washington. We also want to thank Michal Meydan in London. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.